This is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
What did they do and when did they do it? Welcome to A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. This is the most recent in a series of programs we are calling Iron and Myth. And the topic this week is, when did the Watchers fall? And if we get to it, where are they now? The rebellious Watchers that we read about very briefly in Genesis chapter 6. Joining me, the other participants in this irregular ongoing series of programs, Pastor Doug Van Dorn, Brian Godawa, and our friendly neighborhood PhD, Dr. Judd Burton. Guys, thanks for joining me again tonight.
Hello.
This ought to be fun.
Judd, one of the things that really influenced me was hearing that interview, and I've mentioned this before, an interview you did years ago with Dr. Future on the old late lamented Future Quake program about your work at Caesarea Philippi, Panias, the Grotto of Pan, and how influential that is. And of course, that sort of grounds this whole narrative in the Bible of these rebellious sons of God who disobeyed, crossed the species barrier, and commingled their seed with humanity, taught us things we weren't supposed to know. I guess the question is that we have not yet addressed in this series: when did this happen, and when did any of the rebellions happen? When did was there something that happened before Genesis chapter 6? What are we dealing with here?
Well, I think that the prime rebellion begins fairly early on in the first few chapters of Genesis. You know, if we want to call the larger overarching rebellion, the satanic coup that happens, if you want to couch it in political terms, that happens in heaven, happens fairly early on in the biblical narrative, in fact, in Genesis. And from our perspective, you know, there's no reason to think that it happened all at once. From our perspective, it may have happened in a kind of snowball fashion, and that the idea caught on amongst different castes of angels. And one of the major groupings, contingents, if you will, because we're talking about multiple ranks in the Mount Hermon event, one of the big contingent groups to rebel and fall would be the Watchers. So some of that is challenging, to say the least, particularly if we want to stamp a date on it and say on this day and such and such year, this group. I don't really think you can do that, because I think it happened in chapters. That's really the position that I've come to take over the last several years.
Brian, you've done a lot of writing on this, on the Chronicles of the Nephilim, Chronicles of the Apocalypse, Chronicles of the Watchers. You spent a lot of time studying this rebellion, or various rebellions, or stages thereof. What's your take on it?
Well, Michael Heiser, in his materials, what is it, the Mount Hermon, Reversing Mount Hermon, I think it is. He talks about there being, isn't three main falls, so to speak, the fall in the garden, but then there's the fall before the flood, Genesis 6:1-4, and then there's the Tower of Babel incident, where we draw a lot of, those of us in the Watcher paradigm camp, we draw a lot of our understanding from verses like Deuteronomy 32, 8-9. So, yeah, what Judd said is definitely one of those things where I don't see specifically, I don't, other than Genesis 6:1-4, when those sons of God come down from heaven. I know a lot of Christians believe, I think we've talked about this in previous episodes, but also Revelation 12. A lot of Christians believe that, Revelation 12, Satan takes a third of the angels of heaven with him, comes to earth. And a lot of Christians believe that that's the pre-fall, or the Genesis fall, before the garden, I guess. But as I read that stuff, as I read that chapter, it looks clear to me that particular falling that's occurring there is connected with the incarnation of Jesus Christ. When God becomes man, and did we talk about this much in previous?
We haven't talked about that. No.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a whole different, ball of wax. But my point being, though, that I don't think there's very much description in the Bible of what it was like of Satan's fall necessarily, or of the Watchers, other than the couple texts we have, And so Genesis 6:1-4 is the one that I rely on most. That's the days of, the days of Jared, when they come down, and that's still long before Noah, So, but then the second part would be when we talk about the Babel incident, Deuteronomy 32, 8-9. That's the particular most relevant to us now, in the sense that, we argue in our camp that that's when, the Gentile nations were placed under the authority of the sons of God, and so that, I guess, will be part 2 of the discussion. But yeah, that's kind of not a lot. I don't. There's not a lot that we can make definitive conclusions on, other than that there was.
Doug, you addressed this in your book, Sons of God, Giants, Sons of the Gods. Do you have any thoughts as to when that rebellion might have taken place, if we're going to put a date on it from an archaeological standpoint, in terms of prehistory, when that might have taken place?
Well, so I think we know that the Jews believed that the one before the flood, that led up to the flood, happened in the days of Jared. I mean, there's a wordplay going on in Enoch about descending, which is what the word Jared means. They descended in the days of Jared. So I'm comfortable with that particular fall, but I think that it's probably right that there was multiple falls with multiple, I don't know if it's kinds of beings or just different ranks of brothers or whatever is going on. It's interesting to read some of the pseudepigrapha with regard to the fall of Adam, and to kind of see that, I think this is in the life of Adam and Eve, that particular book, that story, where God makes man, and then he parades Adam in front of Satan and basically tells Satan to bow to Adam. And Satan's like, I don't think so. It's not going to happen. He's a ball of mud. And so they give basically that thought of God creating Adam to have dominion over us as the reason for the fall of the devil in Genesis. And I've always thought, of all the things that I've heard and a reason for what why that fall would have happened, it's the only thing that even makes any kind of remote sense, that there has to be some kind of a motive. Why would he have done this? And that's a good one. There is one tantalizing clue to me, and this is in Ezekiel 31. This kind of gets back to our discussion with Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28 that we talked about before. So I don't know what you guys will think about this, but this is a prophecy to Pharaoh, and God starts talking about Assyria, and he calls Assyria the cedar in Lebanon. So basically he becomes this world tree. And in that text, it starts talking about how all the trees of Eden are going to fall, and they're going to be punished in Sheol. It's a very similar idea to the fall of whoever that being is in Isaiah 14. These will be punished, down in Sheol, but it personifies these trees, the trees of Eden. So what in the world could that possibly be? And I think that there's some reason to think that, when Adam was hiding in the midst of the trees of the garden, that there's some kind of supernatural thing going on there, that there's other beings that are present. And it's not just that he's trying to hide behind some bark of wood, but he's going to the other beings that are there and seeing if they can offer some kind of protection from Yahweh coming in the garden in judgment. So if that's the case, and there's that personification is based in real history, then I think there's some support there to say that Satan wasn't the only heavenly being that fell in the garden. But did they fall before that? I tend to think no. I think that the impetus for their fall was probably the creation of Adam and having dominion here.
I agree there, and in fact, I dig into that in my most recent book. And the thing that I thought was really interesting about Ezekiel 31 and 32, and then the corresponding reference to Assyria or the Assyrian in Isaiah 14, are these connections to the netherworld and the connections to Bashan and Lebanon. Ezekiel also makes reference to this, and I'm trying to find the reference here in Ezekiel 27, I believe it is. I wrote about this in a previous book because he condemns, here we go. Ezekiel 27 is kind of a parallel of the condemnation of Babylon in the book of Revelation, in that the lament for Tyre and the destruction of Tyre is kind of echoed by John in the book of Revelation. But Ezekiel points out that Tyre, which was the maritime power of the ancient world, the Phoenicians were the great sea power of antiquity. And he writes that they made all your planks for your boats of fir trees from Sinir, which is the Amorite name for Mount Hermon. They took a cedar from Lebanon to make a mast for you of oaks of Bashan. They made your oars. And I think he's making a point when he's connecting Tyre to Hermon, and specifically using the Amorite name for the mountain. I mean, the Phoenicians were just the Amorites of a more modern era. They were called that because they came up with the purple dye that made the Tyrians really, really wealthy. The Greek word for purple is like punic, I think, or something similar to it.
Punis.
So you've got a connection there, and the Assyrian. I realize there's not a lot of scriptural support for this, but I went out on this limb anyway. That the word for Assyria in Hebrew, Ashur, is the same word that is translated as the Assyrian, even though the definite article in Hebrew, ha, meaning the, is not present. It's also the name of the chief god of Assyria, Ashur, who was the Assyrian Enlil. So I argued in my book, say, what if those condemnations are directed at Enlil, the creator god of Mesopotamia, where the Israelites in the time of Ezekiel had just spent, or were just beginning their time in exile. And then I go on to identify who I think this character is in history. I think that's the same entity as Shemiyaza, the leader of this Watchers' Rebellion on Mount Hermon. Now, again, it's speculation because the Bible doesn't say so explicitly, but I suspect that 2,500 years ago, Ezekiel's readers and Isaiah's readers would probably have had a better context for what they were writing about than we do today.
Where did you say Asher was being mentioned? I lost my place here. I was in Ezekiel 27, was it?
It's in Ezekiel 31 and 32.
Okay.
And
31 is where the trees of Eden are located.
Right. And it's
so is it 3? Behold, Assyria was a cedar in Lebanon?
Yeah.
Gotcha.
But then you also see it in Isaiah 14, where God says he will break the Assyrian on the mountains of Israel. But the definite article in Hebrew,
that's gotcha.
is not present. So it's not I will break the Assyrian. It's either I will break Assyria or I will break Ashur, which again is saying Enlil. And when you get into Zechariah 4, and God through Zechariah says, "Who are you, O great mountain? Before Zerubbabel you will become a plain." Great mountain was the epithet of this entity. Ashur, Enlil, Dagon. That was, the name of his temple was the Ekur, the house of the mountain. Again,
I think so many people, when they read these, they just think of either the supernatural or the human. But if we're dealing with a king, and the kings get their kingship from the gods,
right?
And there's a God that stands behind each of these nations, then especially in something like Ezekiel 31, where the Assyrian is now likened to these trees of Eden and stuff, I think you really are doing injustice to not see both of those things being in play.
Fair enough.
Now, we're trying to be careful not to read too much into the text. I mean, it's possible to go overboard in that, but
yeah, definitely. Well, so the Watchers. Okay, so we draw a lot of our notions from the book of First Enoch, and while it's helpful, etc., there is something here that I've had to sort of just, I don't know, admit or acknowledge that it is also something that we're making connections to that I think are fair, but nonetheless we are making connections that are not always explicit, and that is the connection of the Watchers with the sons of God, who have been appointed to the Gentile nations in Deuteronomy 32, right? The sons of God, and also the sons of God in Genesis 6. And the word watcher biblically is only used in Daniel 4, and they're heavenly beings who are announcing something, And so one of the things that I've had to sort of, like I say, acknowledge is it's sort of like drawing all these together, you kind of come to the conclusion that these sons of God, bene ha-elohim, bene Elohim, bene Elim, these various versions are used synonymously with the Watchers. But I will say, you read in Daniel 9, where it talks about the Prince of Persia and such, doesn't use Watcher there. But if the Watchers are the sons of God who have been allotted to the nations, Deuteronomy 32, then are we right in connecting those two and saying, well, those are the same as the Watchers mentioned in Daniel 4, and are those the same as the king of Persia and the king of Greece? I operate that they are, but I admit that it's a connection being made. It's not always as explicit as I would like it to be, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think that I think we're on safe ground to say that most, if not all, of the Jews believe that. They make it very explicit in many, many, many writings. But I also think, if you just stand back and you go, okay, so you have a divine council. We know that the sons of God are on the divine council, just from a purely biblical point of view. We know that the point of the divine council is to decree things on the earth. And so the Watchers are not just in the only place they're mentioned for certain in the Bible is Daniel 4. They're not just announcing a message, but they also tell Nebuchadnezzar that this is from the decree of the Watchers. These guys decided this. And so then you have to ask, well, what kind of a position would they be in to make that kind of a decision? And that, at the very least, it certainly fits with what the divine council is.
Sure.
And so if that's true, then are there multiple kinds of beings that would be on the divine council, or would it just be that, the simplest explanation is probably the best, that they're synonyms?
Well, I think that's a really good question. When you look at the description of the entity in Ezekiel 28 and compare it with Genesis chapter 3, when Ezekiel 28, the rebel from Eden is described as the guardian cherub who covers, but in Genesis 3, he's a nakash, which is the word usually translated serpent. Now, Ezekiel gives a very specific description of what the cherubim look like. The four faces: human, lion, eagle, ox. And in Ezekiel 10, it's even more specific, where it's human, lion, eagle, cherub. So the cherubim probably are bovine in appearance, sort of like those big, bull-like winged things that stood outside the palace in Nineveh for the Assyrian kings. So how can he be both? Well, I argue that they're separate. They're different things. That Genesis 3 is referring to Satan, but the rebel in Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28 is something else, and I argue it's Shemiyaza. But
gotcha. Again,
it's speculation because the Bible's not explicit. But I do think there are different types of entities in the spirit realm that we're dealing with.
Judd, you're with us. You're with us, man. If you got a connection, you got to speak up.
Butt in.
Well, as you guys are talking, it just seems like one of the things we have to keep in mind is that these entities are coming from one cabal of, or at least when we're talking about the bene ha-elohim or Watchers. And again, I think that's a good point you make, Brian, is that we are making a connection there. I think it's a grounded connection, like Doug pointed out. There's plenty of of text, both biblical and extra biblical, kind of make those connections to tell us about the way that the ancient Hebrews thought about this sort of thing. But even in Enoch, first Enoch, we have some breakdown about that there were watchers that remained loyal to Yahweh, like Uriel and Raphael. Now, grounding those back into the biblical text is another thing, but there is that separation that's made. There are those that remain loyal and those that sided with the satanic coup that I was talking about a moment ago. No, I agree with Doug and Derek, and I think you too, is that there's a case to be made based on text for making that connection.
Let me throw in something that I kind of stumbled onto, and this was through using the Logos Bible software and just highlighting the word cities in Isaiah 14, verse 21, where this rebel is being condemned by Isaiah, who declares, "Prepare slaughter for his sons," which is another reason I don't think it's Satan, because there's no evidence in the Bible that Satan or the Satan was connected to the creation of the Nephilim. But prepare slaughter for his sons because of the guilt of their fathers, lest they rise and possess the earth and fill the face of the world with cities. And when you highlight that word cities, Logos brings up, other connections and whatnot that you can draw from that word. And I was startled when it brought up the reference in the Dictionary of Deities and Demons in the Bible for watchers. Mm-hmm. And I know Mike Heiser's pointed out, and I don't know if he agrees with me on this point or not, but the Hebrew word for city, Irim, is identical to the Aramaic word Irene for watchers. So if you translate that with assuming that Isaiah was using an Aramaic loanword, as Mike argues is done in the Bible for Nephilim, meaning giants, borrowing from the Aramaic word for giant, lest they rise and possess the earth and fill the face of the world with watchers. I mean, is that plausible?
Isn't that interesting? Because Derek, you and Doug are familiar with it. I'm not sure if you are, Brian, but the paper last year on the connection between Rephaim and the words that we use for king and ruler and prince. I don't want to dive too far into the periphery here, but that region, I've come to think it as important and biblically pertinent because of its situation in that region. That's the side of Göbekli Tepe. But if Irene, it means city, and also watcher. That to me is fascinating. That right there is maybe another linguistic connection related to this profusion of the R consonant syllable and its cognate throughout Eurasian languages. That is fascinating. I'm jotting that down right now. I'm looking more into it.
Okay, well, let me give you another verse then, because in Numbers 24, verse 17, which is the famous prophecy of Balaam, he, beginning at verse 17, "I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel," which, of course, we know is a reference to the Messiah. "It shall crush the forehead of Moab and break down all the sons of Sheth." There's another point there, but I'll skip over that. "Edom shall be dispossessed. Seir also, his enemy, shall be dispossessed. Israel's doing valiantly. And one from Jacob shall exercise dominion and destroy the survivors of cities."
I'm telling you, man, that's
the whole thing. That whole prophecy is so weird, supernatural. I mean, he starts talking about Amalek, the giant tribe that people don't even understand who that is, the first of the nations, and so what you're saying there, Derek, fits right in with that idea.
Well, okay, I'll go back to that other point I was going to skip over because it gets into linguistic stuff. But the sons of Sheth is a reference to a tribe I know you're familiar with, Judd, the Shazu or the Shutu, who are referenced in that. The Kadesh Stela, where Ramses the Great went to war with the Hittites, and they captured a couple of really tall spies from the Shazu tribe, Scholar Amar Anus has pointed out in one of his papers that the son Sheth is a reference to the Suteans, who were a tribe of Amorites well known in ancient Mesopotamia, referenced in a number of texts, considered really dangerous highwaymen. You know, you've got to have extra protection for your caravans crossing the desert because those Suteans. But apparently, the word Sutean was the more recent name for this tribe prior to the time of Abraham. According to Anus, the name of the tribe was Tidanu, which Anus then showed in a paper titled Are There Greek Rephaim, was the origin of the word Titan. So you got the sons of the Titans, essentially, in that verse in Numbers 24:17.
Mm-hmm.
So is he just talking about these tribes that were supposed to be really dangerous desert dwellers, the Bedouin, essentially? Or was this sort of a backhanded reference to the sons of the Titans, who would be the Nephilim?
So we've got the fall, or whatever, the what would you call it, the incursion, or the watcher, the sons of God, Genesis 6, which, you know, Enoch talks about there being 200, right? But there, you know, the flood does a major wiping out, and all those bad sons of God are, you know, at least according to Enoch, right there, they are bound and entombed. Well, not just Enoch, yeah, right. Of course, Jude and 2 Peter. But point being, though, that then Babel comes along, and God separates the nations, and he places them under the authority of the sons of God, or the allotment to the sons of God, but Israel is his allotment. So that's where we get our notion, one of our dominant scriptures, where we get the notion that at least after that point in history, nations now have some watchers over them. And then we draw a lot from Psalm 82 as well. God takes his place in the divine council in the midst of the gods. He holds judgment. Now those are the ones in heaven. But how long will you judge unjustly? He talks about, you know, them being wicked. And we also know other passages like Psalm 58. Do you decree what is right, you gods? Do you judge men, children of man, uprightly? No, in your hearts you devise wrongs. So there's a few scriptures that talk about these rulers, these watchers, as being wicked. And so the next question in my mind, I don't know how really important it is, but it's certainly, I think, worth the discussion is, you know, since this is a post-flood thing, right? So these must be new beings. Maybe they're the same kind of beings. Maybe they're sons of God, but they're watchers. And so the question becomes, did God appoint them, the nations, to already fallen beings? You know,
that's a good question.
Or were they originally upright, which would give you this idea that, so God is giving the nations, Gentile nations, don't forget, under the authority of these righteous angels, and then the angels become wicked. I mean, that's the other option. And, you know, because nonetheless, we see that there's a judgment on them for not judging justly. They're supposed to judge over these nations justly, and they don't. And, you know, that to me, the prima facie, looking at the text, it appears to be, oh, they were good, and then, you know, then they went bad. But I think in broader context of things, I actually think that they were fallen already. But that would be something for me to prove. But what do you guys think about that? Were they already fallen, or were they righteous angels that were given the authority and then they fell?
So if the Tower of Babel is the source of this, and if we are the ones violating their space now, so the reverse of before the flood, where they're the ones who came here, now we're the ones crossing over there, I would think that the contact that is made is not going to be with unfallen creatures. Or if they were unfallen, it's a lot like the Garden of Eden that I was talking about earlier, that they kind of fell right there.
Yeah.
You know,
pretty soon. Yeah.
Yeah, or very soon. So Plato has a little bit to say about this, which I think is really interesting. because somebody like Justin Martyr believed that Plato actually, or at least Solon, his grandfather, actually came into contact with the Jews. And because there are certain things that he writes that are like they're coming straight out of Moses. And one of them is almost a word for word commentary on Deuteronomy 32:8, that the gods were given to the nations, allotted. He uses the exact same language as Moses does. But what Plato says there is that he's talking essentially about the golden age. And he says that Greece was given Athena and Hephaestus, who were given to philosophy and beauty and art and all this kind of stuff. And so he's playing it up like these are really good deities. And then this is in the talk of Atlantis. He says Poseidon was given Atlantis, and over the course of time, he says, they became corrupted. So it seems like it would be more than just a Jewish opinion, because I think the Jews would probably agree with this too, that originally they weren't as bad as they became later. Whether or not they were fallen or not, I would tend to agree with you, Brian, that they had to have been fallen, but corruption gets worse over time.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
So, and if it's a punishment, why would God punish the nations by giving them these unfallen creatures to rule over them? It doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Well, it's like God declares, I am God, there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning. So it's not like he didn't know this was going to happen. So the question then is, why did he allow it? And I think this gets back to the old question that skeptics throw out. Well, if God is good, why do bad things happen to good people? I think the answer is free will. He created not just us, but the spirits in the spirit realm with free will as well. And when they got here and saw this was a pretty nice place, that hey, let's just set ourselves up with our own little kingdom here.
Yeah, and I think also the other skeptical thing is, what kind of God, like the Bible, the Ten Commandments, what kind of God gives laws that you can't keep, but it's like, well, because the law was given to show us our sin, not because we could actually be good. That's the biblical understanding, at least. But I kind of see it the same way with this. Is that you look at Psalm 82, and they've been giving they're supposed to be judging justly. Well, then why would God, give them a couple things? One, what Doug already said, that man's wicked, but it also comes in with the concept, the whole Old Testament concept of the Gentile nations, right? The whole thing of Genesis 10 and those 72 nations is that these were the godless ended up versus Israel, and Gentiles is the negative concept all throughout, and separating Israel from the Gentiles, and don't do what the Gentiles do. I mean, Gentiles is a very negative word. We don't have to prove that, right? And so I think that if God is giving these Gentile nations under authorities after they've continued to rebel against him, it makes more sense to me also that it fits in the Romans 1 paradigm where he gave them over, talks about how God gave in a way the Gentiles, but mankind over to their sin. And so it's sort of like, if you're going to, how I always describe it is like, if God is going to be punishing, he's going to place humanity under wicked rulers to rule over them. It would still make sense for him to say, for him to have that righteous law of, you are under them, you are their authorities, you should rule. It's more like saying you should rule justly. They don't. And they won't, but they should. And so, and that commandment of that you should rule justly is also illustrating and showing that they're wicked, because if he just gives it to them and gives them no commands, then who can say what is right or wrong for these watchers, right? So that's how I see the big picture too, weaving in with other biblical concepts. Like I said, I don't think it matters theologically in our case because it's way after the fact. And if you look at the earliest place where it talks about these watchers being fallen at best, as far as I know, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong here, but is the Deuteronomy passage. Deuteronomy 32, later on 17, where it says, Israelites came into Canaan, they worshipped gods that were not God, they were demons, right? And so at least there's this notion that, these gods are already fallen, at least by that time, by the time of the Exodus, right? But one step for I lost my train of thought, but anyway, that makes the point that at least I was trying to make at first.
I think there could be one other aspect we haven't talked about, which is that. So why does the Bible want to call them sons of God so much? Why not watchers? Why would he use that term? And I think that that's a really important thing. And Mike has brought this out in his work, and I think it's really important. So I think it goes back to dominion. If God originally gave the Son of God, Adam, dominion, and then Adam blew that dominion, essentially I think the idea is that he was disinherited. Okay, so if he was given a place on the divine council, which I think is essentially what Eden is, and he's the human representative, and he's the one disinherited, well, who is going to inherit the rest of this place? Got to be somebody, and he has other sons, so why wouldn't it be them? Maybe there's something legal going on there. And so we always talk about the other end of it, where they're disinherited because of Psalm 82, but they're disinherited so that the Son of God, Jesus, can end up inheriting all things and then giving that back to his brothers who have faith in him, who have now become true sons of God. So I think there's something more than just, even free will and stuff like that. I think that there could be something legal that's taking place there.
Sure.
I think at least part of it is that it's just a kind of badge of judgment, a badge of shame. By calling them that, it immediately, given their fallen and rebellious state, it immediately illustrates the position that they've lost, that they've been removed from.
Yeah.
We discussed this with Timothy Alberino a couple of months ago. Actually, it was last summer already. And he raised an interesting possibility that is in his book, and I'm forgetting the name of the book now. Anyway, it's his most recent, his only book, but really some interesting and deep thought, which is really not fair, because not only is he a deep thinker and a really elegant writer, he's out there, hacking his way through the jungles of South America with a machete.
You were paused for a long time there, Derek. Probably.
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
right before you launched off into your explanation, so we pretty much missed it all.
Yeah, we missed the whole thing.
Well, it got recorded on this side, so that's all that matters. No,
okay.
We discussed this with Timothy Alberino last summer as we were talking about his book, and he speculated. Birthright is the title of the book, and that was what it's all about: is that humanity was created specifically to rule in this domain, and the sons of God, being of a different stuff, were created to rule in a different domain. I mean, which is hinted at by Jude when he writes that the angels who sinned kept not their first estate, or left their proper dwelling place, and that's why Christ had to be both fully divine and fully human, so that he could essentially become king of the world. Which is why these sons of God can't do it. They don't have the right to do it. So I think, Doug, you may be onto something there, that there's a legal aspect to this, that it's got to be a human who eventually ascends, if you will, to the throne of earth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which might explain the creation of the Nephilim. Maybe that the whole point there was to try to create a half human, half divine who could fill that role.
Yeah, it certainly does have the hallmarks of a mockery of the very incarnation of the Son of God. The Nephilim do, don't they? And those are the kind of connections. And then in Psalm 82, which for my personal pitch, I've written a book on called Psalm 82 that you can buy on Amazon, in paperback, audiobook, and ebook. Anyway, I use Psalm 82. What I like about Psalm 82 is it kind of does have the narrative that we are eventually walking through, about the watchers, what where they come from, what their responsibility was, and then what is their ultimate end, and in a way, I think it kind of bleeds into that next component that we were talking about. Whenever they became wicked, they certainly have been wicked, and they are wicked, etc. And so then the question becomes, or is it too soon to be asking that question? Do we even have time to start launching into that? When do they get judged? Because in Psalm 82 talks about how, you are God, sons of the Most High. Nevertheless, you shall die, fall like any prince. Arise, O God, judge the earth and inherit the nations. So there's a couple components there that are linked to their end of those sons of God. Is that what we can talk about next, or should we wait till another session? Or
maybe that could be the next session. We could focus on the death of the gods.
But I will say this. There is a good argument for there still being gods, because have you guys seen Moon Knight, the Marvel series Moon Knight?
Just the ads.
Yeah.
Yeah. They have Egyptian gods. They're literally, and as far as I know, I'm not familiar with the series, the actual comic book, but as far as I know, it's not like they're aliens or anything like that. They appear to be the deities of Egypt, and it's interesting because they're drawing from the mythology of the gods, and they're bringing them into the modern day in a very clever way. And not that I would recommend it for people, but it definitely reminds me of some of these movies like the Eternals and such, where they're bringing in that component of some kind of spiritual principalities and powers.
Well, I was considering watching it, but I see it's on Disney Plus, so that's right out.
Yeah.
That may be by design, because Marvel Fourth Phase is supposed to be more heavily laden with the supernatural stuff, because they've broken through the multiverse now. And you've got movies like Morbius, the Living Vampire, the sequel to Doctor Strange. You've got Blade, the Vampire Hunter coming up. And, of course, Moon Knight on the streaming series.
Interesting. But I find it interesting because it's just more explicitly religious now. You had Thor, but Thor was one of those ancient astronauts thing where it's like, okay, it's the Nordic theology, but it's sort of more like they're other planets, Mm-hmm. But now it appears to be strictly spiritual, and it just kind of shocked me. I didn't expect that, but
I'm making notes for future programs, because that would make for a good program too. How theology is presented through Hollywood, which Brian is right in your bailiwick.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and probably be one of the higher views. You get the most amount of views from that, because people just love when you talk about movies and theology and stuff like that.
Comic books and so on. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me throw out.
So back to the waters.
Oh, go. Yeah. Well, let me throw out one other thing. Genesis 1 verse 2, we see that the Spirit of God is hovering over the deep, and that is in Hebrew, that's Tehom, which is essentially a cognate for Tiamat, another name for Leviathan. Is that evidence of an initial rebellion, the rebellion of chaos that must be subdued by God in order to bring the natural realm suitable for humanity into existence?
So I would say that the best we could say is it's possible. My thought is, when you look at Genesis 1:1, it's such an incredibly difficult verse to translate, and we don't even really know. Scholars are not certain on what its function in the rest of the chapter is. Is it like just an introductory verse? Is it a summary of the whole chapter? Is it all part of one long sentence that goes all the way through verse 3? And it's just it's notoriously difficult to translate. But I think just looking at it theologically, if you think about the flood, and what is the flood? It's really a returning of the earth to the condition of Genesis 1:2. Okay, so here you have a flood that's bringing us back to Genesis 1:2. However, there was a whole bunch of stuff that precipitated it. So I think there's room there to say that it's possible that there was something that precipitated the same situation in Genesis 1:2, but we're not told because it's not relevant if it happened or not to the present state that begins with Adam and Eve in the garden. So that'd be my take, is that it's possible, but I would say it's pretty speculative we just don't have a lot of text to go off of.
I think that's a wise way of saying it. I mean, I would have to admit that too. It's like, yeah, it's possible. I don't find myself in that camp, but largely because in my most recent novel, I did all this studying of Egyptian religion, and what shocked me, you've got the old history of scholars arguing that Genesis reflects the Babylonian Enuma Elish, and they think that it reflects a Mesopotamian sort of creation paradigm. And I certainly see some comparisons in there. But when I studied Egyptian religion, I blew my mind. I didn't realize, like, oh no, this is Egyptian. I mean, this is Egyptian influenced. I mean, I'm not a syncretist, but the idea there is that this was the same language used of the Aeneid, which were the 8 deities, and they were described the same way with, waters and chaos and such. But I think the bigger picture of creation narratives, too, is such that I think the theological purpose of them is to proclaim their God as being the one who creates order out of chaos. And chaos represents... chaos could just simply be like, for the Jew, the Gentiles were chaos, the sea was a symbol of chaos, but chaos was that thing which they considered anything outside God's kingdom or God's rule within their domain as they understood it, right? And so the purpose is to say there's, God creates order out of chaos. And so I see the big picture sort of creation narrative structure that way. So that's why I don't personally see the need for talking about the fall. But like Doug said, it's like, there's always much more to the text than we often expect. So it's certainly possible to speculate on that.
Let me throw this out then. Were there layers to this rebellion? In other words, did Satan start things rolling by getting Adam and Eve kicked out of the garden and out of the protection of the divine council? And the second phase of this was, okay, now let's bring the hybrids into play with the other group, the second wave rebellion on Mount Hermon. And was the third wave precipitated just because humans had been conned into, I guess the third wave, was that precipitated because humanity tried to bridge the gap between the old gods who'd been banished to the netherworld through the Tower of Babel?
I like it.
Yeah, I think that's a possible scenario, a likely scenario, actually. Because I like I said at the beginning of our discussion, is I think that this happened in chapters. That the fall wasn't just, there was an initial fall, but it's like any sort of political idea. It spread and gain momentum and affect people in different ways and at different times. And so I think, you're looking at a sequence of events here rather than just one.
Yeah,
I guess I would add that in Genesis, so I got to be careful how I say this, because of the heresy of, what do they call that? The
Van Dornism? Doug Van Dornism?
Well, everything I say is a heresy, man. But this is a specific heresy. It's the Cainite thing or the serpent seed with Cain. I forget what they call it.
Oh, yeah.
Serpent seed, yeah.
Yeah. So I do not believe that Cain is the son of Satan and Eve. However, I do think that there's a lot of sexual tension that's going on in those few verses that's just really strange, from Adam and Eve's nakedness to the things that this serpent is doing to the kids that come out of it. And I think that plays into what we find going on in Genesis 6. In other words, I don't think that the Genesis 6 thing just sort of happened. I think that there's a good reason to think that there could have been forethought going maybe all the way back to the garden. And I think you can tie it to the text.
Yeah.
Well, certainly if that's the setup, I think theologically the sort of punchline is the curse on Canaan after the flood, where, now we're talking Genesis 9, where
which harkens back to the Garden of Eden. The whole
right.
story.
That's what I'm saying. Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. Like you're setting up this, but there's nothing. It doesn't go into it explicitly, right? But maybe, like you say, there's some sexual tension. I would say that's certainly viable. But it comes out explicitly in Genesis 9, which is connected to the Nephilim in Joshua. So, Ham, father of Canaan, sees the nakedness of his father. Verse 22 of Genesis 9 told his two brothers outside. Now there's massive theological debate here, but some people interpret that literally as if he just saw his father's nakedness. But there's some pretty solidly viable scholarship, and I mean it's in the text. It's not even, you don't even need the scholarship. I mean the phrase "seeing the nakedness of your father" is actually used in Leviticus and Deuteronomy to describe having sex with your father's wife, or with that man's wife.
Right. So, yeah, it's a euphemism.
Right. So I made that argument long ago, and even in my novels, the idea there is when Noah awoke, knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan." Canaan is the fruit of Ham, and who did Ham have sex with? Noah's wife, his own mother, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's sort of the fascinating, and now the link comes with Canaan. Interesting that the person's name Canaan is the same name as the land of Canaan that has the seed of the serpent in it that they are trying to destroy. But here's the interesting thing. Lately, I've kind of altered my view a little bit on this. Some other Nephilim nut, made this argument to me, and I'm like, you know what? That's a really good point. In the same way that seeing the nakedness of someone is having sex with their wife, biblically, we also have to remember, because it always troubled me that, but it's like, why would Canaan, the son, if Ham rapes his mother, why would that son of that union be cursed? Why would Noah curse him? I could see him cursing Ham, right? But here's the interesting thing. It doesn't talk about the passage of time, number one. We don't know how long this was after the flood, Canaan could have already been grown up, but let's not forget that when they refer to sons in the scripture, it could be immediate son, and most often is, but many times to be the son of is not immediate. And this guy makes this argument that it was actually Ham's son Canaan who did the raping of Ham's mother. And because he, and the youngest son in that context could be that if this happened later on in time. And that would at least, look, it is also a kind of speculation. I don't know, maybe not, but it makes more sense of why Canaan would be cursed if Canaan was the one who did it, if he had grown up and done it. And if that language of referring to sons is not always referred to the immediate son, especially if they're trying to focus on the primogenitor of the line, like Ham, it's in the line of Ham. It could make sense that they're saying son of when they're actually referring to grandson, which would be Canaan, But anyway, that was a fascinating concept that at least helped possibly explain the reason why not only is Canaan cursed by God and the seed of the serpent are to be wiped out, but Canaan himself was cursed. But was it for something his father did, or was it for something he did?
No, again, only speculative, but lest people think we're trying to read too much into the text, there are a couple of examples of this happening in the Bible where Reuben, the oldest son of Jacob, goes into his father's concubine, Bilhah, and then Absalom does it to all of David's concubines during his rebellion, and he does it on the roof of the palace so that everybody can see. It's pretty crude, but it's like a dog marking his territory. I'm the man. The old man can't stop me.
That's right. It's a dethroning of who Noah is.
Yeah.
It's funny when you think about the Greek Noah, I think his name is Nerus. He's just this pathetic old man. And that's kind of the scene that you get with Noah after this happens. I mean, it's like this just destroyed him,
Oh, yeah. And by the way, that is a common in ancient tribalism. That is a common notion of you assert authority over the tribe by taking that tribal leader's wife. Absolutely. Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But anyway, this is all related to what we're talking about, because that's the curse on Canaan is the curse of the land of Canaan. And that, of course, is eradicating the Nephilim.
Mm.
Well, and in fact, it leads to the lineage of the Nephilim, because Nimrod comes from that, as do many of the other giants. So
That's right.
a lot of people think that the giants only come from Ham's line, but I don't think that that's true, because you can trace a couple of them, at least in extra biblical literature, to Japheth, I think. But I think you're right on the money there, that the cursing of this guy leads to the very same things that we see in Genesis 6.
Well, it's fascinating, and it's intriguing that there's just that there are these little clues that are sprinkled throughout Scripture. I mean, none of this is essential to salvation, which is very basic, just accepting the historic fact of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, understanding that he died for our sins, rose again on the third day. But it does help us to understand.
Thank you, Derek. Thank you for saying that. You know, I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's just like we need to keep verbalizing this, because sometimes those of us in this stuff can get so into the details of all these theological obscurities and esoterica, and it's like, you're right, man. What matters, we got to keep in mind, what matters the most is the resurrection of Jesus Christ, which is interesting because that is connected to the next topic of discussion on our next episode. So
absolutely.
I'm sorry, were you leading into that and I stole your thunder?
No, I think it was a perfect segue. I mean, hey, I try to be like a point guard here, pass the ball so you guys score. But no, I think that's brilliant, because that's really what this is all about. The death of the gods and the fact that they will not be resurrected. And, Isaiah had stuff to say about that. Isaiah chapter 26, when you actually read it in context, it's like, oh, okay, we'll be resurrected. They won't. Cool. And that's what Paul writes about in that very same chapter, which is kind of what I was referring to. 1 Corinthians 15 makes it very simple. The gospel I preached to you, which you received, in which you stand, and by which you are being saved. Very simple. He was buried. He died. Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures. He was buried, raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures. That's the gospel. That's the heart of it right there. It's that simple.
And we as fellow Nephilim nuts to just plead with our audiences, to remember, and for us to remember that that's our goal, is to share the gospel of Jesus Christ and his resurrection with others. And we've got to be careful not to be so caught up in these minute details of theology that we minor or major on the minors, instead, and minor in the majors. And and I don't, sorry to sound preachy, but it's kind of rooted a lot in what I've been experiencing in my church in the last couple of weeks. They've been encouraging that, and just really, remembering that gospel is the main message that we have to people, and that everything has to be ultimately rooted and pointed towards that
Amen.
Glory. So,
Amen. Well, let's close on that. Doug Van Dorn, pastor. Forgive me, Doug. Your church again is the
Reformed Baptist Church of Northern Colorado.
I was going to get about half of those words in there, so I'm glad you were right on it.
It's a lot.
Award-winning Hollywood screenwriter Brian Godawa, and our, as I call him, our friendly neighborhood PhD, Dr. Judd Burton. Yeah, late at night, and the blood sugar is beginning to crash. Thank you for paying attention, and check the show notes for the websites for all of our guests, and we'll be doing this again sooner rather than later. Next time, yes, the death of the gods. Iron and Myth 5 already recorded, and we will have that for you in the month of June as we continue this series with Dr. Doug Van Dorn, Brian Godawa, and Dr. Judd Burton. Fascinating guys, and who knows, over time we may include some other guests as well in that roundtable discussion. Coming up, the sanctions against Russia are having exactly the opposite effect. And, gasoline has hit a record high here in the United States, but good news, the Biden administration has managed to bring down the price of crack pipes. That and more as A View from the Bunker continues straight ahead.
Deep in the earth, The dark god plots and waits as the day is coming when he will be released from his chains to loose literal hell on earth. This most terrible time in human history is known by the ancients as Old Saturn's Reign. Skywatch TV is proud to present the Saturn's Reign Prophecy Package. When you order Derek Gilbert's new book, The Second Coming of Saturn, and Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker's book, 315, The Genesis of All Prophecy, from the Skywatch TV store, you'll also receive Derek's mind-blowing 13-part video study guide for his new book, The Second Coming of Saturn, on DVD, packed with paradigm-shifting revelation and a running time of over 4 hours. In his book, The Second Coming of Saturn, Derek speaks of a new age that began December 21st, 2020. Many experts pointed to the cosmic anomaly known as the Great Conjunction, a meeting in the sky of the planets Jupiter and Saturn, as the triggering event, heralding a new golden age ruled by Saturn, the old god who once reigned over a world of peace and plenty. But it's a lie. In this groundbreaking book, you'll also discover why Lucifer is Saturn, not Satan, evidence that Saturn was the leader of the rebellious sons of God, the identity of Apollyon, the angel of the bottomless pit, the connection between Mount Hermon and the Mount of Olives, hidden Bible prophecies of God's final judgment on Saturn and the Watchers. Also included in this special offer, Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker's new book, 315, The Genesis of All Prophecy, where he details his upbringing as a young Jewish man confronted with the truth of Jesus the Messiah, and how he unknowingly stumbled upon the ancient and primordial prophecy that is connected to every major prophetic event in Scripture. In 315, The Genesis of All Prophecy, you will learn how God's very first prophecy impacts every chapter of Scripture, see the catastrophic consequences of Satan's plan to eliminate the Jews, recognize how Satan's insidious and pervasive agenda has invaded every sphere of influence, be empowered by the Holy Spirit to play an important part in defeating Satan's diabolical agenda. But that's not all. In this must-have collection, you'll also receive The Second Coming of Saturn 13-part study guide. In this exclusive DVD, author and researcher Derek Gilbert personally takes you through all 33 chapters of his new book, The Second Coming of Saturn, and provides a deep dive into his research, including complete chapter breakdowns with ancient artifacts, maps, and other teaching devices. This tool provides hands-on access directly from the source. Sold separately, these items hold a retail value of over $70. Yours now for your donation of only $35 plus shipping and handling. So unearth the ancient prophecies of our Messiah and the rebellious dark gods as you discover the second coming of Saturn. This collection is available only while supplies last, so don't delay. The Saturn's Reign Prophecy Package, available now at skywatchtvstore.com. Order now or call 1-844-750-4985.
Talking the Walk every Sunday night from the beautiful Missouri Ozarks. This is A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. You find us online at VFTB.net. That is our main webpage. You can also go to gilberthouse.org, gilberthouse.org. That is our, well, really, that for Sharon and me is our global web hub. It's also where you find our weekly Bible study, the Gilbert House Fellowship, verse by verse through the Bible in chronological order, posted about midday every Sunday right there. Follow us on social media, Twitter at View From Bunker or at Derek Gilbert. Facebook, our page is View From The Bunker. We're on Truth Social now at Derek P. Gilbert. Also, Gab Me We Get Her Parlor at Derek P. Gilbert. Well, sanctions. It was the intention, we were told, of by Joe Biden and our European allies, Boris Johnson, the rest of the EU, that we would basically starve the Russian economy by putting the brakes on purchases of commodities, including corn, wheat, oil, gas. But it's turning out that that's a little more difficult to do than actually saying so. The Europeans, especially the Eastern Europeans, are heavily dependent on Russian coal, oil, and natural gas. But even the biggest consumers, Germany, I mean, that's the whole point of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, was to deliver gas directly from Russia to Germany and bypass Ukraine. So it is turning out that this is more difficult than people thought, except for people that have, a brain, who saw that this was going to happen right from the get-go. It is now being confirmed by a German think tank that found that Russia's oil and gas revenues hit a record high during the month of April, 1.8 trillion rubles in a single month after 1.2 trillion in March. Now, again, this is with sanctions in place to starve Russia of the money that it needs to wage war. So it's not working. According to this German think tank, after only 4 months of 2022, Russia's federal budget has already received 50% of its planned oil and gas revenue for 2022. Russia is receiving about 50% more oil and gas revenue per month than they budgeted for. Bloomberg has confirmed this. So the restrictions on oil and gas, which has driven gasoline prices to the highest level ever in the United States, went up over $4 a gallon on average in all 50 states of the United States this week. That's the first time ever that this has happened. And analysts are saying we'll probably see $5 a gallon on average by the 4th of July. So we're paying higher prices, and Vladimir Putin and Russia is collecting more money than was budgeted. Now, I am, for one, tend not to believe that people rise to the highest levels of government, especially in the United States, by being complete idiots. They might have some wacky beliefs, like the Green New Deal, but they're not idiots. I am not entirely convinced that this wasn't the plan all along. Let's get those rubes out in flyover country paying through the nose for fossil fuels, and then they'll be begging for green energy. That'll do it. It's not going to happen. I just don't see the day when farms are run with electric implements. It's just not going to happen. But anyway, clearly that's not happening. Also, we've got a perfect storm that's lining up in the wheat industry. Reports this week show that most of the major wheat-producing countries around the world are being affected one way or another by adverse weather conditions. Too dry, too hot, too wet in some cases. Here in the U.S., the central U.S., the wheat belt, dry, and the winter wheat not going to be the crop that was expected or hoped for. The only places in the world that are, even China, by the way, a major wheat producer, is looking at conditions that are way too wet, and it's affecting its winter crop, or its wheat crop. But the places where they're expecting bumper crops, Ukraine, except that the farmers can't get in the field. And if they can get in the field, they can't ship the grain because the ports are not shipping anything because of a war. And Russia is expecting a bumper crop of wheat this year, just as wheat prices are going through the roof because of the war and other weather conditions. So all of this is not hurting Russia or Vlad Putin the way the West intended. And it's not being reported, of course, by the corporate media that this is the case. So we shall see. And meanwhile, while this is going on, Glenn Greenwald, independent journalist, pointed out this week that the United States, with the $40 billion in aid that the U.S. Congress pushed through, I mean, Biden asked for $33 billion. Why $33 billion? It's almost like they're, trying to give a nudge, nudge, wink, wink to the occult adepts out there, the number 33, very important, Scottish Rite Freemasonry. But Congress bumped it up to $40 billion. Now, we've already sent about $15 billion, various stages. About every 2 weeks, beginning in February, Biden announced another several $100 million in aid sent to Ukraine. Congress added about that was about $3 billion in those little increments. Then Congress added about $13.5 billion in the middle of March. And then now another $40 billion. So we're looking at $53 billion spent in the first 3 months of this conflict between Russia and Ukraine by the United States to arm Ukraine. Now, Just to give you some context, that's more than the United States spent on average per year to fight our own war in Afghanistan. The average amount spent by the U.S. in Afghanistan per year while we were there was about $46 billion. And here in 3 months, the United States is sending $53 billion to Ukraine. This is getting awfully close, in fact, to Russia's annual expenditure for its entire defense budget. Something like $66 billion, I think, is the report. The United States spends 3 times more than the second company on the list of annual defense expenditures. The United States spends 3 times more than country number 2, which is China, and spends more than the next 12 countries combined. So somebody is benefiting from all of this. That's always the important question to ask when anything hits the news. Who benefits? And according to Greenwald, of this $53 billion that the United States taxpayers are now on the hook for, $53 billion in 3 months. Some of it will be economic and humanitarian aid, but the majority, more than half, is going to the weapons industry, the military-industrial complex. That's who wants this war to last. War is a racket, and sadly, business is very, very good. Pray for the people of Ukraine because they're caught in the middle of this, and soldiers on both sides in the front lines who are fighting for Raytheon's stock value. Well, the Skywatch TV Defender Conference continues through August 13th. Take advantage of that because not only do you get a couple of dozen cutting-edge presentations, Tom Horn's presentation on the transhumanist movement and its goal to essentially turn us into God-men through science. That's a documentary in and of itself. Tyler Gilreath's presentation on Leviathan, Tiamat, Taming Tiamat, and a lot of others. The list is at defenderconference.com. Tom Horn added as a bonus, a free bonus, access to all 5 of the Skywatch Films documentaries, which includes his The Secret Destiny of America and Belly of the Beast, which look at the occult symbolism in Washington, D.C., and the prophetic significance thereof. Inhuman, the next and final phase of man, is here, the award-winning documentary that started all of this for Skywatch Films back in 2016. And the award-winning Silent Cry, Josh Peck's documentary on child trafficking for occult purposes that won a gold telly in 2021, one of only 5 films to receive the gold telly out of 13,000 entries. So you get access to all 5 of those films in addition to the 24 presentations for your registration, and you can do that at defenderconference.com. As you are watching this, assuming you're watching this on Sunday evening, we're wrapping up the Homeward Bound Conference in Colorado Springs. We'll be returning back to the Ozarks tomorrow, and I am certain that there will be DVD sets of the conference after the fact. I talked twice. I'm speaking in the past tense, even though it's still future for me, but that's, time travel through technology. It's really, really quite cool. And some other great speakers that you want to see. If you didn't have the opportunity to take advantage of the streaming video, keep an eye out at Prophecy Watchers' website for the DVD sets, prophecywatchers.com. L.A. Marzulli, Mondo Gonzalez, Ryan Pitterson, Dr. Ken Johnson, Bill Salas, many others. It's well worth it. The Go Therefore conference coming up in July. Registrations are now open for that. That one just $59 for registration. Pastor Mike Spalding, Pastor Carl Gallups, Pastor Casper McLeod. Lots of pastors in this group. Dr. Michael Lake, David Heavener, Coach Dave, Kenny C., Tom Dunn, and more. This will be July 29th through 31st. Sharon and I will both be speaking at this event. This is at the Harvest Revival Center in Brookville, just outside Dayton, Ohio, and we hope you'll join us there for that. Skywatch TV's tours of Turkey and Israel. Turkey, October 18th through November 3rd. I talked last week about that really cool new discoveries coming out of Karahan Tepe. We are looking forward to seeing some of the artifacts from there and seeing Göbekli Tepe with our own eyes. We're both reading now a novel written by the guy who wrote the piece for The Spectator in the UK about Karahan Tepe. So, kind of firing the imagination here and maybe get back to writing some fiction myself here sooner or later. Skywatchandturkey.com to find out more and reserve a spot in the Turkey tour and the Tour of Israel, March 19th through 30th of 2023, with an optional 3-day extension over to Jordan. That is just going to be an amazing tour because of some of the new discoveries found there. Joshua's altar, Lachish, and of course, we're learning more now about the significance of the Galilee and the Golan Heights, ancient Bashan, not just in the Old Testament period, but during Jesus' ministry as well. And looking forward to seeing the Serpent Mound of Bashan and recognizing it for what it is this time. I mean, we saw it when we were there before. We just thought, oh, hill between Gilgal Rephaim and Mount Hermon. Interesting. Yeah, didn't recognize it at ground level. More on that at skywatchinisrael.com. If you get a spare moment, we appreciate you leaving us a review or a review for us at Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, wherever else you find us, which is, of course, wherever fine podcasts are sold. Give us a like on Facebook at the View from the Bunker page. And remember our announcer, the inimitable DC Good. A View from the Bunker is a production of Gilbert House, released under Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. We wrestle not against flesh and blood. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is A View from the Bunker.